talk a bit about the Newport Survey?
Yes.
I mean, there's already an acquired knowledge around the table of what the Newport Survey was, but maybe you could define it for people that might be listening that are not familiar with it.
The Newport Survey was a practical documentary survey of Newport during the 1980s. Its proposal was actually quite simple in that we were a documentary photography school. The course consisted of a series of exercises and the final project of your own choosing that you could work on. But the school itself did not have a focus other than that educational teaching position at the time. When I first started, some of the students only worked for 1 year, some worked for 2. When I arrived there, they had 2 years, a 2-year course to look forward to. That was part of my employment. And that we also had to move the course to a position where it was validated. It hadn't been validated before. It was a college diploma. And the powers that be decided it should be validated, and it made David was very opposed to it going full-time 3 years to the degree model, because he thought that was too long. It needed to be short, sharp, professional. He was happy for it to go to 2 years because that would give the students more time, but he had to take more students and it had to be validated. It was suggested by the advisor, the education advisor for higher education, that, and the college authorities, that BTEC, or at that time it was called DATEC, should be the validating body, because this was a profession you were going to go into, a technical profession. So we chose to go the DATEC route, which rapidly within a year became the HND route, and my job was to translate the documentary photography course as it's practically taught into the formula that was required for DATEC, or became BTEC. Part of that formula was that students had to gain industrial experience. They had to do placements in industry. David was very much opposed to this in that his background had been working, not talking about his fashion and studio work early on, but very much the magazine journalistic route. And of course he was a member of Magnum now by long before this stage. That you certainly couldn't go the fashion route because there are no model agencies in Newport or South Wales. There are no studios, professional studios in Newport and South Wales. There are no magazines, there are no publishers, so you can't do it. So it was a real dilemma. We had to somehow find a way to do this, and one of the options, of course, was to let them students make their own placements and they could go off to London or whatever, but that required a huge administrative thing to monitor, because you also have to visit them in their workplace and talk with their employers. And if they all go off to London and sort of around the country, then that was going to be very difficult to do. In the meantime, I was thinking about this and translating the course into this new program and formula, and came up against this as a major block. David was not opposed, but couldn't see how we could fulfill the professional practice criteria. And then David dropped the bombshell after I'd been there only 4 months teaching, and we're going through this process now. We're going to move into the next year of actually finishing writing the course and recruiting the new students on a 2-year basis and onto a validated program, go for validation. And then David dropped the bombshell that he was taking a year sabbatical and he was going off to Arizona on a fellowship at the University of Arizona, where his friend Bill Jay was professor at that time, and Bill had offered him the opportunity. It was great, wonderful. But it left just myself and John Charity and an enlarged part-time budget to replace David's hours. But of course we still, while David was away, still had to write this program that was going to satisfy all these criteria. And I'd been giving it a lot of thought. I thought, well, because I'd done it before, it's a very small model. This is what we did with my first publication, Stepney Words, working with Chris Searle. And this is where these connections, play a part. I decided that, well, if we can't send the students away because we wouldn't be able to manage it and it's too far for them to go to do things, we can't get there's not enough local employers to manage them, why don't we set up our own publishing house? And we'll publish in-house. Now, at the same time as we were considering this, an announcement was made by British Steel that they were going to close the Lamwen Steelworks in Newport. And this struck a chord with me because Lamworn Steelworks was the largest employer. There were actually 3 or 4 steelworks in Newport, all under British Steel. But Lamworn Steelworks was the biggest employer. And if that closed, this is going to have a huge impact on the economy of the town. Hey, and guess what? We're a documentary photography course. My models, and what I was teaching and pushing and promoting, was this documentary tradition that had been encapsulated in the Farm Security Administration work, and Roy Stryker's work with that over 30 years had employed photographers like Ben Shon and Dorothea Langer and Walker Evans, and I was teaching that. I was doing lectures about this. So everything seemed to fall into place, and I said, hey, we have a reason to exist. Let's document what's going to happen to this town over the next 10 years as a result of steelworks closing. I said, this is the equivalent of the Dust Bowl in Newport. And so over a few beers with John Charity in the pub, where all the real business is done, the social things like the coffee, the 18th century coffee house, I said, John, what do you think? I said, we can publish it. John had never done a book. I mean, John had come from being a young student himself at Nottingham, straight into teaching at Newport only 2 or 3 years before. John hadn't exhibited or published much. He was a fine photographer and a great academic, really sort of very good at managing and driving the course. I mean, he basically took over from David. When David went, he had the experience. I was new, only there 3 or 4 months. But John liked the idea. And I said, I can't think of anything more relevant, but if we can put it together, I said we can satisfy all the criteria required for DATEC and BTEC. We can show them all we've got to do is raise the funds to do it and persuade the authorities that we should do it in-house. I said, but we've got a graphic design department here. We've got a printing press down here, which is exactly the same size printing press that I've been printing magazines on before I came here. It was a big Heidelberg press, and they have a full-time technician working with it. Was actually a qualified, I won't say journalist, but in literature. She could manage the text side, and we can bring in an external editor or art director. We'll bring in some journalists to work with them, and we'll produce the book ourselves. So they'll see the whole process, and the idea would be that at the end of the time, we have a finished book, and they will walk away with it when they finish their course. So they've got their first printed stories. So John actually thought it was a good idea. We had lots of discussions about how it might go, and I roughed out a programme for the 10 years. And I went over to the art gallery and talked with them, and I was just about to do an exhibition at the art gallery with John, so I had a bit of influence. I spoke to the curator of the museums at that time, who managed the budget. Unbeknown to me, he just decided to leave. He was going to retire, but in going, he made a decision that yes, he'd like to put £1,000 in. It was his last big spend. So we had the art gallery who would back it with £1,000. We had the art gallery curator said he would do an exhibition, and in return for the £1,000, I offered that we would give them anywhere between 300 or 400 and 500 photographs each year, the kernel of the photographs that were produced, that we edited the book from. And they would have them for their archives, their social history archives, only A4 prints, but basically they got their money back. They built their social documentary archive, and there would be a book come out and they would have an exhibition. And so the project was founded on that basis, and the plan I had was that we would first of all start with photographing the steelworks and the sort of industry. We were overtaken very quickly because the unions protested, and there was a big national outcry about it, and it all went into discussions which took 2 or 3 years to resolve, and the steelworks closure was converted into what they call a slim down. They were basically just going to make it smaller. So the heat was off. We still want to do the industry, but we thought, let's see how it goes first. We can't say it's going to close, and this is going to really affect the town, so we'll push the industry subject back a couple of years. But I had already proposed a set of subject matter to cover 10 years. And one was family life, one was on Newport communities, one would be on industry, another one would be on social life. We would do healthcare, education. The River Usk became important. We had about 8 or 9 subjects straight away, right from the beginning. And I said, and when we get to the end of it, apart from producing a book every year, which should be the professional experience of the student, working with journalists, working with writers, editors, art directors, and seeing the printed job, even going to the printer to see it printed. Some of them did that in the first year. They went down to see how it would be printed, have discussions with the printers and who would put it all together. So they learned how pagination was sorted, for instance. And at the end of the 10 years, we would put the whole lot together in another book, which would be a decade of life in Newport. And this is what I sold the idea on to both to the college authorities and to the Museum and Art Gallery. And then my back plan was that we would start again. And so we would go back then, maybe to the same families, and see how they were living 10 years later. So that would be another 10 years then. You go back into industry. Of course, by then the steelworks would have gone. We didn't know that at the time, but it would have gone. But some of the other industries, like Inmos that we photographed, the electronics and wafer production things, the new technology industries would still be there. There would be new ones. And we would have these contacts with all of these people that we'd photographed, so we would actually be able to go back now and see how things had changed 10 years later. You would have this amazing document of a small provincial British town throughout the 1980s and 1990s. No different a project from, say, the Farm Security Administration. And if you think about that, it was Roy Stryker's idea and model that planned it out in the same way. And before the photographers went out, before he commissioned Dorothy Langer or Walker Evans or Ben Sharn, he'd sit them down in the office. If you're going to photograph the cotton fields down in the, in the Midwest, in the South there, right, you need to know about cotton. He was an economist. He would tell them about cotton, its role in industry, its economics, how it worked. He would talk to them about slavery, and he would brief them. You can read his notes now. If you look in the Library of Congress archives, you can read his notes and what he said to the photographers and the briefing notes that he gave them. So his photographers went out informed. The same happened in Britain. Very little known, it's fairly well known now with history, but very few people know the name. But we had our own British survey in the Mass Observation Project from the 1930s, where sociologists and photographers and writers went and lived in places like Wigan and talked to people on the streets and in the cafes, and then quietly wrote their notes and sent the reports back, took photographs and sent them back. I think it's all located now in the University of Brighton, I think, isn't it? The Mass Observation Archive. Yeah. So we already had two models that I could talk about, and here we were coming into the 1980s and on the verge of a huge depression or recession that I felt strongly, if we were doing anything as a school, we should be giving something back into the community, and we could be documenting that experience.
And it was the perfect time to do it, wasn't it? You think about what the 80s represented for towns like Newport, and there it is, all preserved photographically, really. And it also built a really important bridge. There was already a bridge there between the course and the community, but it really enhanced that, I think, as well, because, of course, the other thing that you haven't mentioned is it was on sale in W.H. Smith's and places.
Absolutely.
And so everybody that lived in Newport saw it, and they either appeared in it or they knew somebody who'd been photographed that was in it. So it became this great thing that was like became a kind of an ambassador for the course, didn't it? Really?
And for the university.
Yeah.
And they're really sought after now. Pictures appear. People lift them off the pages, and they appear regularly on Facebook and places. I'm always writing and correcting and saying, "Oh, I found this photograph. I don't know who it's by," and I'll write saying that's so and so's picture. Yeah. Basically, reminding people it's copyright to the photographer, because that was the other thing. You see, part of the teaching elements and the profession element is we taught them about copyright, how to manage your pictures, how to deal with clients, how to market your pictures. So they were taught about all of those things, and I insisted right from the start it wasn't the university's copyright as a whole. The book was, the publication was, but the photographs remain the photographer's property and copyright. That was important to instill in everybody. But you're absolutely right, Paul, and that was part of what I referred to earlier, that it was really unsure whether it would be fully taken up by the department and would go, because there were so many influences on it, both at a management level and whatever. But we managed to win through those. But part of the issue in the department, because we were a very small staff, was only myself, David, and John Charity. And David was off that first year.
Was Clive Landon not there?
Not yet.
No,
No,
okay.
he came in teaching part-time for the first time in that year when David went off.
Okay.
He was only teaching part-time one day a week or so.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the big arguments was that it's a huge job to not just organise all this big project and the students, but the publication is also going to be a big job to organise. And I said, I'll do that. I'll manage that. You know, we'll sell it in the local shops. I said, it needs to get out there into the news agents. And of course, what did Tom Hopkinson do? He was the first editor. He produced the biggest picture post thing that wouldn't fit on any shelves. So, and that immediately gave us a problem. News agents would take it and they stick it away on the back shelf or something, or they might put it on the front with the newspapers. It was that big, you know. Sort of, and I thought, well, we've got to slim it down so that it can actually fit on a shelf, so it will get into the bookshops as well. And so we did go to the bookshops.
Yeah, it became standardised then, didn't it?
Became standardised.
The format,
until by the end there was a fashion for the large photograph and the large photographic publication. So lots of magazines were doing big broadsheet photographic magazines, you see. And it went back that way in the final year before it finished completely.
And we still have the archive here at the university.
Great asset.
So it is. There's two regrets, though, about it. Firstly, I mean, I understand why the copyright stayed with the photographer. But of course, what that also meant was that the negatives stayed with the photographer as well. So I wish we had all the negatives for all the images. We don't have that. What we have are all the A4 prints that each photographer made. That went off for repro, that ended up in the published magazine. And we've got quite a few of the exhibition prints as well, so some of the bigger prints.
Oh, good.
But tragically, when the course moved from Clarence Place to Carleon, some of it was thrown away, would you believe?
I bet it was the artwork.
It's quite a lot of the prints as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I know that Clive Landon physically climbed into a skip and saved as much as he could. So we have most of it here, but there are big bits of it missing, tragically.
Well, my original model, because I said we should keep this as an archive, and it was in our possession as a department for a long time. We had this steel cabinet devoted to it, but I insisted that we not only keep the photographs, but we keep the artwork as well. So you see the original layout and some of the changes, drawings that were done for them, because they'd work on an art director who would map it out.
We still have some of that.
So and that in itself was also, I thought, would be important because it shows the process.
Yeah.
I feel the same way, because many things I don't like the sort of community magazines. I wish I'd kept the original scans that we had to make the plates. And in fact, I will have some, but I don't have any for the Newport Survey, and we could have kept them so easily, so they could have just been printed again.
Yeah,
and that was a lack of foresight. But it's a management problem, you see. In many ways, you have to say, well, okay, the photographer's rights have got to be respected, and we should be teaching about it, because we need to be teaching them to fight for their rights when they go out there. So we need to understand that from day one, and we shouldn't naturally usurp the rights. On the other hand, there is the argument that if we had the negatives, then it would be preserved, but how much of it would have gone in the skip? So it's a very difficult one. And of course, I mean, it was a useful fallback by giving not quite a duplicate set, but a selected set. I mean, it was as many as 500 pictures a year went over to the museum.
I presume they still have them then.
They still have them.
So maybe between them and us, we might have a complete set.
Yeah. Well, every story would be represented in their collection. It might be represented by only one or two pictures, but in some instances there would be pictures that weren't used in the publication that they have. So we had a valuable resource there.
Yeah. Okay, so as I remember it, Ron, there was an issue a year for the entire 1980s, wasn't it?
No, only until 1988.
Was it?
Eight issues.
Oh.
If you discount G for the record, which it was thrown open to the whole of Gwent because the students were arguing the case for more freedom to photograph other kinds of subjects. Interestingly, something like 66% of that final one is actually about Newport. The stories are about Newport. So I've withdrawn on my criticism of it, sort of, since because it still does relate, but of course it changed its title. Number one was The Family, was produced in 1980, has the date 1980 on, and I think it appeared right at the end in the autumn of 1980. So the project started in 1980, but the second one did not occur in 1981 because of problems we had with the production. And they were internal problems, not of our making, but to do with the faculty and a inefficient print department who blew the first run completely and wasted a huge amount of money. We salvaged that by getting the college to fund it again and getting a sponsorship from a printer, but it meant that we had to spend more time planning how it could be put together. And it took a year to get the graphic design department to come on board fully. The first year we had 2 graphic designers, but they were typography students. They were both photographers, and they were interested in developing their own photography skills, and they have stories. They have stories in those books. That was Steve Barnes and Chris Chapman. Chris Chapman's still around and working in Cardiff. He's just set up a new company.
Yeah,
he lived on your neighbour at one time, and you worked for him. Well, but they were typography students, and they had a bit of a maverick tutor who insisted they were doing the layouts and setting the typography. But before they could complete a page, a double-page spread, their photography tutor insisted they draw it all by hand, every letter.
Wow.
So much so that I had to shift the emphasis in that production, which is why it didn't come out till the autumn, shift the emphasis and teach the students how to do the layout themselves and paste up, because otherwise we would not get it done in time to get it printed. So that took much longer. And it was one of those strange hiccups. But I knew it couldn't work unless I had a more intimate engagement from the graphic design staff. And coincidentally, I was very friendly with a few of them, one of which was teaching part-time and teaching on a different course, a non-degree course, a vocational course. And I went and talked with him about how we might do this and perhaps he could be involved. And so that managed to get us through to the second year, and we spent much of the second year working out the detail of how that would work, because they would have to set up in the graphic design department a group like we had in photography to produce it. And the big argument early on was, it's academic and it's creative. Half the course was illustrators and the other half were practical graphic designers. But they were used to working their style, their approach to the graphic design education, and their experience was for the students to work on their own, initially on exercises, as everybody did, but then they would move to their own projects. They didn't have any industrial experience. They didn't have a thing where they worked on a real project that was going to be published. And so we had to develop models in graphic design where they could do that. Fortunately, we had a couple of part-time tutors who were prepared to move it that way, but it took a year to do. So the second one didn't appear till 1982. Coincidentally, that's number 2. So it was perfect.
Okay. And what size of print run from the first through to?
Only usually about 1,000. I think about 1,000. It might have been that we went to 2,000 or 3,000 in a few of the years as we built up the reputation for it. But we had to tread a line between producing enough for the students and for the community, and getting rid of them and not be left with a huge pile in the office that had to be distributed. And so we couldn't put them into too many. Don't forget, there were a few galleries at the time and a few bookshops. They went into the bookshops in Newport and W.H. Smith's and local newsagents, but there was nowhere else to put them. So we had a lot of press coverage, which meant that we got some mail orders came in. All of those things needed managing in the department. So the run had to be kept to a reasonable number, that we had enough for promotional purposes and enough that by the time we made some sales through the local outlets, it got rid of the lot.
Do you have a full set?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Do you have a full set?
Several full sets. I have one that I loan to people now and again to have a look at, which are really battered and all stained. I have one fairly pristine set on the shelf for my own reference, and I can find immediately the full set. And then I have at least one other set wrapped up in a box, maybe 2 sets No, I mean, we did it out of love, quite frankly. We were working 80, 90 hours a week on it. It was, it wasn't a regular job. I was always in at 8 o'clock in the morning. Paul will testify. I was always in at 8 o'clock in the morning. I wouldn't be going home till 8 or 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah. We used to have a saying that we still use first in, last out documentary photography, and that's kind of how it was, wasn't it? And you definitely worked your socks off on that. So
we worked, and even with the photo media department, when I developed that, we planned and the part-time degree. We planned to work right through till 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. We were doing lectures at 6 o'clock, and students had come from, say, Torquay or Southampton, and they were getting a 9 o'clock train to go home.